could use our effort, but the operation that was going to be organized had to be within a general advanced searching for a bigger objective. This objective was in Ronda, that's why the book is called Objective Ronda. The train went through it, it came from Algeciras and it went to Granada, so they having these lines meant being able to have these railways where they could introduce weapons and men for the future conquest of Malaga. This military operation was organized officially because it was going to be taken from 3 fronts. From the north, the Luis Redondo commander leading one of the columns would take Saucejo, Los Corrales, Martín de la Jara, and then they came back to Villanueva and Algávida. From Antequera, Varela, had already Varela, would go to Campillo, Teba, and it would join the column in Cañete, the one that came from the south part of the mountain range, and there they would follow towards the occupation of Ronda. With that strategy, on the 3rd of September, the whole operation started with Commander Luis Redondo, together with the representative of Requete in Seville. They left on the 3rd of September towards Saucejo, and the main military leaders stayed. They stayed in the current university. At 5 in the morning, they started marching towards Saucejo, and they started shooting cannonballs, and there was not a lot of resistance, only the militia with guns, with shotguns, and they could do nothing. And they had to flee together with their family through along the road that goes to Campillos and into the province of Malaga. On Monday, 7th of September, once Saucejo was occupied, they left to Los Corrales, and in this point they placed a cannon, and there you can see the population, and they started throwing cannonballs to the village. 1/3 of the 4,000 inhabitants of that village left searching for Campillo. At 5 in the afternoon, they were going into the streets, kicking the doors, shouting hands up, white flags, and something that stayed in people's minds, long live Christ the King. And with these ultra-Catholic feelings. They also took Martín de la Jara, seeing how hundreds of neighbors of Martín de la Jara were escaping towards Campillo, the province of Malaga. Immediately on the 11th, they came back. They took Villanueva and Algamitas, and in the same story was repeated. Trying to escape and searching for the province of Malaga. People escaped, as we said, and they continued marching towards Cañete and there in Cañete they joined the troops that had left from Antequera. These are El Algabeño with the rich people on horse. They came from Seville. And José García Carranza is the one who accompanied Varela in the taking of Campillo, and he was famous for being a fascist who cooperated with Sanjurjo in the attempt of coup d'etat of the year 32. On Sunday, on the 13th of September, with so many people arriving in Campillo, they never knew that Varela would leave Antequera with, apart from the troops from Morocco, some infantry troops, Tablada planes, they got there without finding any kind of resistance. In 2 hours, they got into Campillo, while hundreds of families were running, terrorized along the road of Ronda. The persecution took several kilometers and many people were reached. And later on in Campillo, many neighbors were shot. On the 14th of September, they occupied Deva. Before, this morning I think, they talked about the occupation of Deva. In the same day that it was occupied, they killed 80 people that same night. They didn't find any kind of resistance there, and Deva's population would start running as well towards the area of Lechur. This is the road that comes from Cañete, and this is the crossroads that leads to Ronda. There we have Redondo, and leading the Requetés and Varela. And I don't know if you've gone through that, but the same design of the road is kept, and even if years have gone by. And they continue, they get to Cuevas del Becerro, and the shooting of, the mass shooting of peasants took place as well. On the 16th of September and on the 17th, the Moroccan troops are shooting towards Ronda. Also, Tablada planes are bombing Ronda and leaving, of course, the streets full of cadavers. Finally, in Ronda, the two columns, victorious, meet up, and there is a parade, and another part of them continue to persecute the people that were running away towards Alcántara, and fulfilling most of their objectives. Once the operation is finished, and if we compare it with the map that we saw before, these are the advanced points and the spot that they were taken gradually, and the new Republican area stayed behind El Chorro, with the populations like Alora, Carratraca, and other ones that were close to Malaga. Families were arriving in all of that area, the ones that were fleeing away from all those occupied territories from the south mountain range of Seville, Antequera, Ronda, and many remember how they were welcomed, how this village welcomed them. Many of them started to work on the fields in the valley of Guadalquivir, and they stayed there for 4 months. Many neighbors that just were scattered away in the country villas and the other villages and the occupied area, they thought, you know, if we haven't done anything, maybe if there's nothing to fear, and they could come back to their villages, because they heard that if there was not blood in their hands, then they could come back. But they could never imagine how the local far-right political parties would start with the punishment and the cleaning process that they decided to do house by house, family by family, and street by street. The Falangist militias started to work with the members that got daily salaries of 3 to 5 pesetas, and this revenge was in the hands of armed bands that started to act immediately. I say armed bands, armed groups on wages. I found an old book by the committee of the Red Cross, and as they didn't have a lot of paper, in the middle of the book I started to see some numbers and names. First there was the list of people that were part of the Phalange, 60 or 70, and then I saw some pieces of paper that said, I have received the amount of 5 pesetas by the chief of the militia for today. So this is the day when they started killing people in my village. And then I could see these other pieces of paper. This is the first time I'm showing it in public, because the sons and the children and grandchildren of these people still live there. These are the people that they remember were the killers that went out at night to kill all of those people, and these were the amount of money that they received. 35, 25, 25 pesetas, 35. There were several pages like this one, and I was emotionally affected by it when I saw it. This page in which you can see that people are receiving money for killing other people. So the most bloody terror started then for the neighbors of those villages. Crimes started with no statement whatsoever, and they happened daily, mostly next to the walls of the cemeteries, and many times they went to arrest those chosen. They would beat them, they would tie their hands and lead them towards the place where the killers were waiting. And others, after being arrested, they obliged them to dig their own graves in the afternoon where they would rest at night. There were many women taken there. They were raped because they had been sewing the red flag, or because they had relatives that had escaped. I have to clarify that in that area we don't talk about la Desbandás, we talk about la huía. And when they came, they said they were rehuío, which means that they came back after fleeing away. But if the death arrived many homes, there were also hundreds of women who were vexed in a way that they copied from the Italian fascists, and they shaved their heads and they forced them to drink some kind of very aggressive oil to purge them somehow. And this is what was happening in those villages right after the occupation. But together with those that had fled away to Malaga after the second week of January in the year 37, they started to conquer the Franco ships that started bombing the city. So the arc of action would stay at 50 kilometers, more or less. And the Republican resistance was kept up until 6th of February. But they were not very well organized, and they started to come back to the city. And finally, on the 7th, that's when they ordered the massive escape along the road of Almería. They talked about 150, 250,000, 300,000. So that was with all the people that came from the areas we mentioned before. Other things that happened, and I was told about this by a man who was carrying water, because in Malaga many people came from those villages and regions and nobody knew them. So they arrested them, they had them there locked in several places, and there were the committees, the right committees that knew them. They just led them to a patio and they started saying, yes, we know them. He was there, he was there, he was there. And at night, they were shot. And many of them died on the 10th, 11th, and 12th of February of the year 37 in San Rafael Cemetery. And we have seen their names there. There's a high number of neighbors of the south mountain range of Seville and other locations. After the fall of Malaga, part of those that had not been arrested started to be brought back, because that was part of the normality, the coming back of those people to their places of origin. There was a good amount of people. But they were not expecting or imagining what was awaiting. And when they saw them, there was always this group of people that went to the civil guard facilities to say, this man is coming and he was doing this, he was doing that. This other man came and they did this, and some of them were voting the Popular Front, etc. So they were making some reports with those people that were offering that information, and immediately they were arrested in local prisons, councils, schools. And there is a very curious anecdote of a family in my village. They left to Malaga, and when they came back, they saw that their house was full of prisoners. So they were prisoners in their own home for 2 or 3 weeks until they took them to Seville. And many of them were shot between March and July of the 37, and others were shot in the capital cities. This is a provincial jail in Seville. There were trials there, and many of them ended up in San Fernando cemetery in Seville. They started the second repression. Before we said it was the first repression, and now there was a new wave of repression. Here they had a war court, a war trial that would execute them, and the provisional balance of victims would give us an idea of the terror that took place. Osuna, the first one that fell, 242 dead people. In Saucejo, a village that had a little bit more than 4,000 inhabitants, 160 deaths. Algamita, a village with less than 2,000, 182. Villanueva, with less than 2,000 inhabitants, 162 deaths. In Corrales, 101. In Martín de la Jara, 28 dead people. So there is a part in those villages where nobody from the right political side were killed. Together, we have 875 victims and 972 prisoners. And we, of course, have to add the victims that appeared in the other regions. For example, Antequera, 1,205, and in Ronda, 673. Altogether, 2,843 casualties. Of course, those figures have gone up because that's something that was published in 2015. Most of them were not registered in the books in councils, and they were not recognized by Catholic Church.
There is a third wave of repression, but I'm not going to broach it because we don't have time. But anyway, the number of victims keep rising. And we have needed many years after the coup to start documenting with the names, with the dates, with the places of all these victims of reprisal. So I'm going to stop here. Thank you very much.
Bueno, pues el siguiente ponente es Manuel Morán Castro.
So our next speaker is a technician, and he works in the field of environmental management in the area of Córdoba. He's Manuel Morán Castro, and he's going to make an intervention entitled Flight and Resistance in the Valley of Guadalquivir. He's worked on this research with Professor Naranjo Portugués. And he's going to talk about the experience of peasants of the Valley of Guadalquivir, so territories that were occupied by the Francoist troops from August to September 1936. Sorry. Manuel, the floor is yours. Hello. Thank you very much. Our book, the book I made with Luis Naranjos, entitled Huida y Resistencia en el Valle del Guadalquivir, was an attempt to collect all the information about the peasants who were living in the Valley of Guadalquivir at the time, the lives, the work they made. But when trying to do this, when interviewing these people, they always told us about the war, which had been the most important experience of their life. So all the stories about the 16th February 1936, in all the small villages where there was a dream of achieving universal rights for all the citizens, education, equality and progress. In the area where I live, which is Almodóvar del Río, in the valley of Guadalquivir, is one of the richest areas in terms of fertile soil in Andalusia. And there are many big landowners. It is called the Campiña, and it is close to Seville as well. And we have been a territory with many demands and many revendications, many claims in terms of working rights, because in this area there was slavery. It was very common, and it was work from dawn to dusk. And one of the demands these people made, these peasants made was the agriculture reform, agrarian reform. So after February 1936, these peasants were really afraid of losing the privileges they achieved with the Republic. But the landowners were working in a conspiracy because they didn't want the peasants to take advantage of the privileges provided by the Republic. So these landowners decided not to plant all the fields, for instance, on strategies like this. So we had people like Cruz Conde, Eduardo Queto, who were big landowners. And if you ask to the people from Córdoba about these names, they would say that these are street names of the city in Córdoba because they were very powerful landowners. And of course, there were the military like Queipo de Llano, Cascajo, who was also very well known in Córdoba. And in Córdoba, in the capital city, the genocide starts on the 19th of July with a great number of executions commanded by Luis Zurdo, a commander of the civil guard. And then we have an even worse commander who was Don Bruno, because Luis Zurdo, he liked going to bars as well, so he wasn't so focused, but Don Bruno was really focused on this kind of executions. So the city of Córdoba hosts the first Desbandás towards the mountains, Cerro Muriano. There were hundreds of people being shot, mainly trade unionists who had made a strike to complain about the coup. And after these trade unionists, there was the families as well. Nobody knew exactly what was going to happen. So at the first time they hid in the mountains. On the 18th of July, the peasants of Andalusia woke up just like every day, like a normal day. And they were going to the fields to do their tasks, their duties, their very hard work, without knowing what was going to happen to them. So the 19th of July, the province of Córdoba had 48 out of 75 municipalities under the control of the rebel army. But the peasants were not didn't accept this, so they fought with all their means against the rebellion. And most of the rebels who tried to take the control of the municipalities found the opposition of the peasants. So immediately they started to create defense committees, Republican defense committees, or even revolutionary committees, because there was the birth of one of the rare singular revolutions here, because the people took control of the wealth of the landowners for the first time. So they created facilities for distributing food, other goods, because so the workers organized all this quite with success, in fact.
Los trabajadores ven que los cuarteles estaban siendo ocupados por la Guardia Civil, como he dicho antes.
So the civil guard start taking control of the quarters, and the peasants try to defend these facilities with what they had, shotguns or everything they had. They put in place barricades as well. We have José Bernéz Aguayo, a young commander who died later on and who works with other militiamen to organize a significant group of militiamen to try to stop the rebel army. It's very difficult for me to pronounce these words of the criminal Capo de Llano, because these are such terrible and savage words. But everyone knew this message, all the inhabitants from the villages of that region, from the 26th July 1936. Here is the province of Córdoba. You see in black the limits of the province, and in purple you see the advancement of the rebel army in July 1936. Some people may ask why the people from Córdoba didn't flee to Jaén. But the reason is that in the south of Córdoba they were much closer to Malaga. For instance, villages like Puente Genil, Rute, they were closer to the Republican territory of Malaga.
Desde Córdoba salían.
And from Córdoba we had soldiers bombing villages like Almodóvar, for instance. We have some impacts in the castle, and we can see, and we know also that they killed quite a high number of people. And many of the families escaped to the mountains, and they would just sleep outside or find some shelter where they could hide. They didn't know if the situation would last more or less. So they say that they hid in the mountains like rabbits. So you see here Almodóvar, Sierra Morena, the mountains, and places where people tried to hide around the village in an area of some kilometers. And you see two people here, Antonio Gavero and El Algarreño. Antonio Cañero, who was a bullfighter, and they were friends with Capo de Llano. They were members of the Falange. Antonio Cañero, El Algarreño, he acted mainly in Seville. So we used to say that they were riding horses, and they were carrying rifles, and they were just killing everyone they wanted, just like that. And then at the end of the day, they will go back to Córdoba, they will go to the bars and tell everyone what they had been making the whole day. For instance, on the 27th of July 1936, they killed in Almodóvar del Río Soledad Pastor Serrano. They just get to her house and just killed her. I could give you many examples. For instance, Josefa Gallero Alcaraz, who begged these mothers to please let her give birth to her child, but they didn't. They took her to the cemetery, to the walls, and they just shot her. And they gave her castor oil, and they put bags on her mouth. This is a picture of some women in Montilla as well. Women who couldn't escape from the village, and they suffered all this kind of atrocities. They would shave their heads, gave them castor oil, and then later on just kill them. This is a picture of a fascist newspaper where they say that in Fernan Núñez they took a group of militiamen, and they said they had hunted them and killed 53 people in one day. So this is one of the first pictures they published showing a mass execution. This news got to the villages, and people, when they learned about this, they just had to escape. Massive killings in Puente Genil. Still more statements from Queipo de Llano. Tomorrow we're going to Peñafort. The wives of the Red have to get ready to dress in black. Morón, Castro del Río, Puente Genil, get your graves ready. I allow you to kill like a dog to anyone who tried to confront us. So the army was gaining ground through the Guadalquivir valley, but they found the barricades from the militiamen. So the militiamen were just starting, it was the very first moment, and they tried to resist, but they didn't have the possibilities, because the army they had in front of them was armed and it was a very experienced army, not like them. Still, somebody who, well, after the arrival of the rebel army on the 26th of August, 10% of the population of Palma del Rio was shot. And the rebel army was the executor of this mass killing, but it was initiated, it was by initiative of Felix Moreno, who was a great landowner and who said, I'm going to kill 10 peasants for every death bull. So when this is because the peasants killed a number of bulls of this landowner, the laborers, when they were seeking for food to distribute to the people. And now he was saying he was going to kill 10 laborers for every bull killed. So everyone who was living in the village lost a member of their family that day, everyone. This is also an image you have in blue, the direction of the advancement of the troops. And on the 18th of July, they get to Córdoba, to the capital city. And then there is a first flight to Cerro Muriano. The 9th of August, you have the same in Constantina with almost 1,000 executions, and with a flight towards Navas de la Concepción. Later on, Navas de la Concepción Falls as well. So basically the whole village of Contastina and Navas de la Concepción, they just fled towards the mining area. On the 20th of August, there's Almodóvar del Río that is occupied by the troops coming from Córdoba. And then it was an escape, a flight from this village towards Posadas, Villaviciosa first and then Posada. Then later on, La Cueva de los Infantes falls as well because of a series of aerial bombings, and the population escapes towards Posadas. And then Posadas becomes like a center. There is also a food distribution center that was occupied later on by the Phalange and the church. And on the 27th of August, we have Palar del Río that falls as well, with the landowner Don Felix Moreno making the executions I told you before, and they escape to Posadas. And in Posadas, there are already around 15,000 people. But some archives show documents where there are around 20,000 people gathered in Posadas. So on the 28th, before the troops arrived to the village, the people from Posadas get in touch with the people of Villaviciosa by telephone, and they have the visit of the delegation from Villaviciosa, and they decide that it is not possible to stop the rebel troops. So there is this great march that starts with thousands of people. We have many testimonies. It's not, of course, the same as La Desbandás here in Malaga, but they also suffered from bombings from the aviation and also by land. And they have these killers, these murderers from the Cañero battalion. So they just went through the crowds with the rifles and just shooting people with these sabers. And then Cerro Moriano, and finally Hornachuelos, which is the last village of the mountains that falls on the 7th of September. And they have a way to escape. It is a very difficult path through the mountains. And a group of militiamen who knew the territory was a very difficult way. And they make this journey, they use this path, but many people get lost because it was so difficult. There was a militiaman called Clarito who guided the group, and he saved many lives. But then he was punished because he did that. These pictures are by Robert Capa and Greta Taro in Cerro Moriano. These are the first pictures of journalists in times of war. We don't have pictures for our territory, but I guess we could have this kind of pictures, groups led by women mainly, because most of the men were in the front line, because most of the people live in Posadas and live in all these villages were women, elder people, children, people who was a little bit lagging behind. They had to... We know that in the sugar factory, the phalange members installed like control points or points where other people was shooting those who were escaping. You have the road between Posadas and Villaviciosa. Around 20,000 people reached this village who was still under the Republican control. We have different spots that were also bombed. Images from Robert Capa. And many families didn't want to leave what they had. That was very few, actually. So they took their animals, and sometimes they had to left these animals behind. They were bombed in the mountains. And one of the things that helped them the most were the huge forests that are in the area and that allowed them to hide. Maybe that was a way of avoiding many deaths. Here, a picture of El Algabeño. Here was a person hunter, and they were chasing people. They chased people. Villaviciosa received thousands of people. And other villages in the area, like Posadas, for instance, they have paid tribute to all the help they received from this village. These 3 women told us their stories. They saw dead people, and they had a very difficult way escaping to the Republican area. And they said, we knew where we had to go. We had to go to the Republican area, of course. Villaviciosa was occupied on the 8th of October. And they fled to La Albondiguilla, which is a spot where hundreds of family, which is a train station where hundreds of family gathered, waiting, trying to take the train. But there was not place enough for everyone. So some of them had to go to Villanueva de Córdoba or other places. And people were forced to leave their donkeys or everything they had. At the time, a donkey was also the way, of transport, and they had to leave many of the belongings there. And of course, it was ship trains, not trains for regular passages.
Gente que se fue en tren por el círculo acá.
So you see both lines, the one. Well, I'm going to finish very soon. So, to Villanueva de Córdoba, where the rearguard was, Villanueva de Córdoba became the destination of many refugees, around 16,000. And we have some documents from Campesinos Sin Tierra. This is the map of the flight of all the persons that tell us their story. For instance, José Torremocha, who was one of the leaders of the defense committee in the area, and he tells us his pathway for escaping. And he told us that it was very difficult to convince people to leave because they would refuse to leave. And when they were already outside villages, somebody told them 2 of the landowners have died. And then people realized that if the landowners are dying, then we're going to die too. Of course, we have to leave. And here there is Eusebia from Palma del Rio. Her family left, and she didn't have time to do it. She was 18 at the time. So she and her friend went to search for some siblings that were lost. They went to the Corralón de Don Félix, and they looked through a window and they saw hundreds of hats, and she recognized her brother because there was a pin that she recognized. And here there's Úrsula Castro Quesada, my mother. It's hard for me to talk. I could tell you so many stories of my mom. She told me many things. But she had her mother, who was a widow, and her brother, and they only had a donkey. And they made her way up to Villaviciosa alone. They didn't know the mountains. They went through a very hard time, and they were bombed as well. They say it was August, and it was really hot. And also, not only because it was hot, but also because they wanted to take their clothes with them, and they had to wear all the clothes at the same time. It was the only way to do it. Here's Adelaida when she got to the station of Hornachuelos. There were so many people crowded there in the ship train that she fell off the train because the train was already running. She fell. Her mother also jumped out to take her. Well, to rescue her. There are hundreds of stories. I do not have time enough. But Ana Ramos Garcia, the daughter of the last guerrilla man from the province of Córdoba, José Ramos Garcia, they also had to flee. And when they came back, her father went to the concentration camps, prisons, and once he finished all her sentences, he came back to the village, but life was so difficult. He had to escape, and he was finally killed in 1952. Manuel Plazo de los Sánchez, my father-in-law, is still hard for me to keep talking about him. He told me so many things. It was so hard. One of the things he usually tells is that they stopped to take a rest in the Guadiato River, and women, because there was always women, elderly, and children, they put the clothes to dry in the plants that were around, and because the military and the soldiers saw the white of the clothes, they started shooting. Manuel Moral Pineda, my father, he never told us what happened to him, never, until he was really old, because he had a great trauma. When they arrived to Villaviciosa, he was 12 years old, and he was playing in the outskirts of the village, and they listened to the planes, and the bombs killed one of his friends, José Rodríguez Ochavo. He's a shepherd. All his family was taken to prison because they gave milk from the goats to the people who was escaping. That was his crime. José Morocobos. He left Fuente Palmera, and he entered into the front to fight for the Republic, and he never stopped fighting. He went to all the front lines in Spain, and he ended up in a concentration camp in France. He went also into the French Legion, and he fought against fascism in Libya, in Algeria, in Italy. And he was very close to the place where Mussolini was killed. Thanks to the flight, many men and women were able to keep on fighting for the Republic, defending democracy in the front lines. So this these flights are an act of anti-fascist struggle. And then many people who were in the Republican area, and they were, because of that reason, they were arrested, executed, or put into jails or prisons. We have a very famous canal where many people from the area was arrested, and they were just working to make something for the rich men of the area. So that was the way they were thanking the rich for what they did for the fascism, and many people died in this spot. And I'm going to finish with this. This was the Spain that we had after the war. Many children working because their parents had been executed, or they were in concentration camps or in the exile. So these children, they never went to school. They never knew the Republican school. They were slave children. And meanwhile, the landowners got their way.
Bueno, muchas gracias, Manuel.
Well, thank you very much, Manuel. We're running a little behind schedule here. Anyway, in the forum for the Memory of Córdoba, you have the book here, Peasants Without a Land, Campesinos sin Tierra. So if there is something that you still want to know, of course, you can contact him. Our next speaker, Gonzalo Acosta Bono. She's an urban geographist. He's been working in the urban services, in the management of the field. And of course, the presentation is much longer, but if I dwell on his introduction, I'm taking time out of what he's going to use for his speech. He's prepared an exhibition on the contents and working methodology through the cooperation and mutual support. And this exhibition is in one of the rooms here. His talk is a reflection on los exilios por el sur, the exiled on the south, and he will talk about how this exile was present in many Andalusian areas since the beginning of the military coup, ways that went to Portugal and to the north of Africa as well. And Gonzalo, you have the floor. Thank you very much. Well, everybody here has said thank you, and I want to do it as well. But as I said, we do not have a lot of time, but I want to transmit several ideas. After the speeches we've listened to, the talks, I was going to propose you to try to place yourself in a moment in which the United Nations have already created ACNUR, the specialized organism for refugees. Because at that time of the War of Spain, these kind of organizations didn't exist. It's something that would, it's a precedent that justified the setting up of an organization like that one. Why? Because, and we have seen that before, Olga told us about it, in this present conflict, the Spanish conflict showed that all of these realities were present, and particularly these two people that talked before me. And the only thing that I tried to do was to interpret this concept, the concept of movement, because they include modalities, the modality of exile, but also internal movements, just like, you know, the road of Malaga, Almería is a witness of that. And these also goes up to the Pyrenees. But I'm going to focus on other exiles that start from the very beginning. At the moment that people start to think that it's the situation's dangerous and a repression is going to come up, exerted by an army that had it in their agenda, as we have seen, with the capo statements and the documents that we have seen. So we have this image of exile, which is very powerful. The 500,000 people that left the French frontier, the border. But since the beginning, the exile on the south is directed towards other regions, other places, Portugal and the north of Africa, since the very beginning, because the army was very fast in the occupation of Cádiz, Seville, and part of Córdoba and Huelva, and since there, the exile is a possibility that is totally and absolutely present in many people since the beginning. The paths followed by this exile is the reason for an exhibition that we presented in the last La Desbandás, and we wanted it to reflect this option that gives rise to less known or worse known situations. For example, the case of Portugal. Why? Because in Portugal there was also a fascist regime, as you know, and they gave the order to take action in the border itself, and the situation took place along the limit, what's called La Raya. It's a not very clear limit when it comes to social relations, and also sharing a language which is impregnated, with words from one language and the other. What happened? That's right, Portugal was not a safe destination, and there were several mechanisms that took place. Many of them ended up in Lisbon, and they were taken back to Tarragona by ship. To a short extent, they could maybe, if they were lucky and if they had some resources, they could try to flee to America. But it was a very provisional situation. In this context, we have to say that what we had was there was an action was taken in the border, in the frontier, with these sudden returns, and we know that that's happening also in the north of with the frontier with the north of Africa. These returns, immediate returns, meant that they had them in jail quite soon. You know, this is a case of Miguel Hernández. I don't know if you know that, because this is not very well known, but he was arrested in Rosal de la Frontera. I'm sorry, in the Portuguese part of it, and he was in the guard post of Rosal, is where his pilgrimage throughout different jails started until he died. But we have to mention that there was a very significant moment in this displacement towards Portugal, and that was the Badajoz massacre. These border passes were used through the river Guadiana and also the Portuguese region of the south, Algarve and Alentejo. And we also have to mention a village which is called Barranco, which is very close to the Spanish border, in which there was an exemplary behavior because they were very welcoming. Houses were open so that people could come in at night, and they behaved in such a way that it was there was explicit recognition later on, and in particular to one person, who was the Secha, who made it easier. Made it all easy going against the authorities that were under the orders of which he was. This exhibition was presented in Barranco because we thought it was a way of giving back something after the solidarity that they showed. And now we're going to mention also the flight that took place from Malaga to Almería. When it didn't end in Almería, but also from Almería they moved towards the north of Africa. From Motril there were many ships as well, and then from Ayamonte as well. They left for Casablanca. In the north of Africa there was a significant presence of exiled people who lived in this territory, including, of course, Morocco and Algeria, but also Tunisia, where people that were part of this Republican Spanish army ended up. This map shows as well some of the most relevant things of this north of Africa exile. This is where the concentration comes. This was the way in which people were gathered. For a long time, the Vichy regime in France, nicest one, it started a project that was called the Trans-Saharan train. That was some kind of a dream that had already been thought about since the beginning of the 20th century, and the authorities of Vichy decided that it was the right time to implement that, to carry out that work. That would link the north of Algeria in the Mediterranean coast to the Atlantic coast in Dakar in Senegal. This reality was very much debated on from the technical point of view, because it was very hard to have a train going through the desert of the Sahara. But some works were carried out, and these have been very well identified thanks to the different testimonies. In the case of this claim, which appears at the end of the text, Spanish, you have reached the field of Jefa, you are in the desert itself, think that here death is the only thing that will set you free. This is reality. This was a work, a project that at the beginning was a photography project. It was called Los Caminos del Ferrocarril, the paths of the train, paths of sand. Because the work that stays there, they are of course very deteriorated, but they were the object of this work, and they show the consequences of the whole thing, because this was not feasible, of course. This project was not feasible in general. And in these fields, there was a documentary that was called Captured on on the sand, and that showed the punishment that they got in these concentration camps, in these works that we mentioned before, but also the hardship in their daily living ended up with the death of so many people in circumstances that have never been studied. Short ago, a year ago or something like that, they discovered a grave, a mass grave. But in a place and a context like that one, and without testimonies that could offer information on where those mass graves are, it's very complicated. And this is what I wanted to say with a little bit more time. But this is what, well, this is the information I wanted to give you. Thank you so much for your attention.
Gracias, Gonzalo.
Thank you so much, Gonzalo.
Si alguien tiene
So we don't have much time left, but if anyone has a question, anyone would like to ask a question? If there are no questions, I'd just like to thank the three speakers and let's go for lunch.